G'day, welcome to another episode of Life in the Rowboat. Have you been thinking, as Richard talks about the rowboat, I wonder when he's going to explain to us where prayer fits into this whole picture of doing life in the rowboat? Well, if you haven't been thinking about it, I certainly have over a long period of time. And I'm indebted to Shane Willard, who's an outstanding teacher from a Hebrew cultural and language perspective. And I heard Shane talking about where we first find a mention of prayer in the scriptures. And it really surprised me. Genesis 4 verse 26. And let me read that to you. And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. That expression, call upon, is the first record of prayer that we find in Scripture. But it's a very odd place for it to pop up, don't you think? I mean, it's basically a genealogy from Adam, and Adam had a son and his name was Seth, and Seth had a son and his name was Enos. And somehow out of all that we get, then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Now, as you know, I'm a bit curious about things that don't seem to fit or make sense. So I started to do a bit of digging because I just needed to understand why this occurs where it does in Scripture. And of course there's always an explanation if you just dig deep enough. And as it turns out, that the explanation to this mystery lies in the meaning of the name Enos. Enos comes from a root word that means the following: to be weak, to be frail, to be incurable, to be desperate, to be desperately wicked, to be woeful, to be very sick. So if you haven't figured it out now, let me share with you this little quote which will give you a big hint as to where this name Enos points us. Someone by the name of R.D. Laing said this: life is a sexually transmitted disease and the mortality rate is 100%. And it's that word mortality that we find in this root meaning of Enoch. It's really all about our mortality. This is even more interesting because you have to realize that Enos was Adam's grandson. So we're just 2 generations on from Adam himself. And as we know, Adam and Eve tasted immortality. Prior to the fall, they experienced what it was to be, potentially, at least, immortal. And not to be burdened by all these things that we found in the meaning of the name Enos. They didn't have to worry about weakness or frailty or being incurable or desperate. They didn't have to worry about wickedness or sickness. None of these things were pressing upon them. With that in mind, we then have to ask the question, well, what is it about mortality? What's the point in having Enos point us to that reality? What on earth has that got to do with prayer or calling upon the name of the Lord? Let's look at Isaiah 53 verses 3 to 5. And there we read, He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. Of course, here Isaiah is writing about Yeshua, and in particular, what would happen to Yeshua as he went to the cross. And I hope you picked up, as I read that passage, the links between the indicators of mortality that we found in the root meaning of enos and what Yeshua accomplished on the cross. And that's the good news, that Yeshua dealt with our mortality on the cross through his sacrifice and his suffering and his giving of himself. That's helpful, but it doesn't really get us to the understanding of where prayer fits into all of this. Well, as I said, that's where Shane Willard helped me enormously. Shane was teaching on this passage, and he shared the word picture meaning for that phrase, call upon, and this is what it means: turning your head to face the one who can bear the burden. Turning your head to face the one who can bear the burden. And of course, the immediate question is, well, what burden? And we could get a very, very, very long list of what our burdens look like. But in essence, the burden is the burden of our mortality. And so this is a powerful picture. If you can position yourself again in the rowboat, and in front of you, you have the past, but also in your line of sight is Yeshua, your coxswain. And he is the one who is able and who has indeed borne the burden of your mortality. But the thing about our mortality is that that's what drives us to want to know what our future looks like. That's what drives us to turn our heads away from the past and try and look into the future. And so, as our heads are turned away from Yeshua towards the future, that's when prayer kicks in, because we realise that we need to turn our head to face the one who has already borne the burden of not only our sin but our mortality. And that's just a powerful image for me, and it's so simple. We're pretty good at complicating things in Scripture. So much has been written and said about prayer, and I've read many books on prayer, and I've learned a lot through those books. But this definition of what it means to pray in its most basic form is just incredibly powerful. Of course, when the Lord shows me these things, I'm always eager to find out whether there's a biblical example that I can tap into. And the best example that I could find was indeed Moses at the burning bush. Now put yourself in Moses' shoes just for one moment. It's 5 minutes before he sees the burning bush. So what's going on in Moses' mind at that point? We know that 40 years prior to this moment, Moses was living in Pharaoh's palace. Moses was in fact in line to become the next Pharaoh. He had this sense of purpose and destiny surrounding his life. But one day he got a little bit ahead of God's agenda and God's timing, and he actually killed an Egyptian who was abusing one of his fellow Israelites. And as a result, he had to run for his life. So the ensuing 40 years he spent on the backside of the desert looking after his father-in-law's sheep. A big contrast between what he had in Pharaoh's palace and what he'd experienced for those 40 years. So do you think Moses was carrying a burden about what had gone wrong with his life? Do you think he wasn't beating himself up about murdering that Egyptian? Do you think he hadn't questioned himself? Do you think he hadn't experienced the reality of his own mortality there on the backside of the desert? And then he comes to this point where he actually sees a burning bush that isn't consumed by the... And when that's recorded in Exodus chapter 3 verse 3. Then Moses said, having seen the burning bush, he said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. And that expression, turn aside, the word picture is actually a slow twisting, like a plant being changed by a prop, making secure a person. Again, this is a lovely image of what prayer is all about. Sometimes it is a slow twisting for us to turn away from our anxieties and our fears and the circumstances we find ourselves in and begin to look to Yeshua, who is the only one who can make us secure. So I trust you find that helpful as you continue to do life in the rowboat. When you feel the temptation to turn your head and to look towards the future, the need is for you to remember what it is to pray, to turn your head towards the one who can bear the burden, whatever that might be for you at any given moment in time. Because Yeshua has indeed borne all our burdens. He's carried it all to the cross. And we can look to him and find all the resources we need. No matter what the situation, he is sufficient for the moment. Well, thanks for joining me, and I look forward to catching you on the next episode. Bless ya.